A big thank you to, a redundant but nevertheless big thank you to Vikram Seth for making this session what it was, and a very big thank you to Shrey for, for making this possible. Um, we'd like to, I now have the singularly unenviable task of trying to hold a session here and to also inform you, which is a pleasant task actually, to inform you that the session featuring Soumitra Chatterjee and Sharmila Tagore will be held here at 5:40, the session called Manik Ratan. Purna Chatterjee, who looks set to travel to the Arctic, and Sreyashi Ghosh, the youngest of our panelists. And I'm Yajnaseni. Since, can you hear me? Since we're obviously running short of time, delighted to be running short of time, we'll, I think, dispense with formal introductions and just very briefly introduce our panelists. Alexandra Büchler, I got the pronunciation completely wrong when I made the announcement just now, is someone who has worked a lot with literature across frontiers. And since the poetry of the war, any war, is not really just confined to one language, though most of us, when we think of war poetry, think of British war poetry, mostly, or English war poetry at any rate. So she is going to lead the discussion on poets from other parts of the world who have written about war and tumultuous times. Sampurna, of course, welcome back to KLM. She's a familiar face. She's done a lot of translations, and very interestingly, she has done a sort of collection of poetry that anti-war is the best way to call it, I suppose, rather than pro-peace. Because peace is not something that we can really hope to find in our lifetimes, I don't think. And Sreyashi has fascinating, I think her aspect, her core area, one of her core areas is her work with refugees and survivors in post-war societies. So she has a dual task today. One, to talk about the role of women because of her work in gender studies, role of women during war, and the role of women in war literature, and also the psychology of a war zone. The kind of psychology that gives rise to this whole new genre. And I want to lead into this, of course, with World War I, since this is the centenary of the First World War. Why would someone be writing poetry at such a devastating time? And these were not third-party observers, these were actual soldiers who were dying and living with the war. And they had, their means of expression were not letters home or dispatches to newspapers, but poems. So much so that World War I gave rise to this entirely new genre called war poetry. And since we cannot talk of war poetry without talking of Wilfred Owen, I think that's one name that all of us here will be familiar with. Why don't you read us Dulce et Decorum Est, Sampurna. Oh, and this is a session on poetry, so there are going to be quite a few readings.
Hello.
You have been warned.
And I must also say that, it's not going to be as grim as everyone fears. It's awfully good of you all to have stayed on after that scintillating session, which we unfortunately couldn't pay any attention to because we were so terrified of this session. So if some of us fumble and lose our cues and go off track, it's only because, well, if I do any of those things, it's also because it's terrifyingly cold and I wasn't prepared for it.
And Sampurna very sagely, which is very unlike her, she very sagely pointed out that, look, none of us are academics or scholars. So,
Yeah,
you know.
So hoping that would be lure enough to make you stay. So thank you for that. And to quickly respond to the point that Yajnaseni made in her introduction, which is why poetry, and why poetry particularly in times of war, I'll start off by, as it were, quoting an academic who's written this extremely lucid and I have to say very readable book called Memories of a Lost War, with the focus being on the Vietnam War. But I think what he says in the introduction about poetry is very valid to our discussion today. Poetry is a form of rewriting, but differs from reconstructions in the political sphere in its refusal to create justifying myths. The best poems articulate individual memories and trauma and raise questions regarding dissent and marginalization. In the words of that wonderful American poet Adrienne Rich, they name and mourn damage, keeping pain vocal, so it cannot become normalized and acceptable. So I think this whole idea of keeping pain vocal is something that poets do with a particular resonance. And Wilfred Owen, when he wrote his war poetry, of course he wrote it as a combatant, everybody knows that. The tragedy is that he died just when he was reaching the peak of his poetic powers. A lot of the generation later mourn him for that very keenly. Yes, I mean, it's like if you saw this in a movie, you'd say, oh my God, you know, they made that up. But it happened to him. And there's a particular reason why I'm reading this particular poem, which will soon become apparent. It's not for the usual, okay, let's commemorate the names that we already know. Part of the what we hope to do is commemorate the names that we have never heard of. So, but I'll start off with Wilfred Owen's. And my Latin isn't perfect, so I'm going to give the mic to Alexandra, who will pronounce the Latin.
Dulce et decorum est.
Thank you. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots but limped on, blood-shod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which for those of us who don't understand Latin is, it is right and fitting to die for your country. So it's a damning condemnation.
We particularly chose Wilfred Owen's poem because it was initially called Reactions to Jessie Pope. And we don't know much about, women war poets, essentially because men document history and men have written poems and men have published the poems that they've written. So it was an interesting shift of gender roles. Essentially, since war is sort of a patriarchal space, so when the men went to war, women there was a shift in gear, and women also went to work in factories and munition. Units, workers, as munition workers, and they took out time for not so much of the most obvious roles that women were meant to play. So World War I really did set the stage for gender roles changing. And here I would read Jessie Pope's poem, The Call, since we're going to look at the not so well-known poets. Who's for the trench? Are you, my laddie, who'll follow French? Will you, my laddie, who's fretting to begin, who's going out to win, and who wants to save his skin? Do you, my laddie? Who's for the khaki suit? Are you, my laddie? So that's the kind of poem that women wrote as a reaction to their brothers, lovers, husbands, fathers going to war and not returning from war. Poetry, has had a sort of, writing had a cathartic effect. So women would sort of play a role in the propaganda for war and advertisements or news letters, bulletins, periodicals.
And it's quite sorry to cut you off, but it's quite interesting if you look at posters of that time, inviting men to join up, sign up for the war. Many of them used women. It was as if women were calling the men to war. I don't know if you've seen any of those posters.
Yes, that's exactly what I was talking about, war propaganda,
Yeah, right.
So now another poem is Vera Brittain. A scholar, Catherine Riley, in 1981, compiled World War I women poets called Scars Upon My Heart. And this very beautiful poem called Perhaps is sort of an offshoot from, masculine sentiment or what men write or how men write. Perhaps someday the sun will shine again, and I shall see that still the skies are blue, and feel once more I do not live in vain, although bereft of you. Perhaps the golden meadows at my feet will make sunny hours of spring seem gay, and I shall find the white may blossom sweet, though you have passed away. Perhaps the summer woods will shimmer bright, and crimson roses once again be fair, and autumn harvest feels a rich delight, although you are not there. But though kind time may many joys renew, there is one greatest joy I shall not know again, because my heart for loss of you was broken long ago. And another interesting point is, George Sand, the editor, took on the name of a man as she worked for her papers. Yeah.
And there was another British woman, I don't remember her name, who dressed up as a man to go to the front. She was a journalist. And because her editor wouldn't send a woman to cover the front, that came out sounding very bad. No, well, cover the war at the front. She dressed up as a man and went out, and she was captured in France, and then made to write sign an indemnity that she would never do such a thing again, and then sent back home.
So coming to the issue of women going to work and equal wages for equal work still being an issue, and we are still raising the issue at Davos, at the various human rights conferences, gender conferences, and papers being written and debates being held about it. There's a short poem called Munition Wages, again in the league of the lesser-known women poets such as Edith Sitwell and Rose Macaulay and all the others. A few lines. Munition wages. Earning high wages, yes, 5 quid a week. A woman too, mind you, I calls it dim sweet. So, it's a sense of empowerment that women got, even if they earned 5 quid, as in this poem. And it sort of changed how history looked, how post-World War I changed society.
Forever, actually,
Yeah.
As society was then. And the other thing is, it was probably actually found that women made better munitions workers. they had nimbler fingers, and they proved better at shaping the casings and, whatever you do at munitions factories. I don't know, but women were found to be better, more patient workers.
And the poetry was even a reaction to women working as nurses in the VAD.
Nurses in the VME, yeah.
In the VAD, voluntary aid detachment. Yeah. So then there's another little poem by Eva Dobell, Pluck. Crippled for life at 17, his great eyes seemed to question why. With both legs smashed, it might have been better in that grim trench to die. Then drag maimed years out helplessly, a child so wasted and so white. He told a lie to get his way, to march a man with men and fight. So this thing of men fighting and women sort of looking at the household and other sort of lesser chores has sort of start to depreciate in its...
and women became the breadwinners. And this poem also raises the issue of underage soldiers, which is an aspect of warfare that didn't exist, I think, until then. There were certain codes of war that were followed, and the Great War broke most of them. And even today we are grappling with the problem of child soldiers. And I think the First World War was the time when people, boys lied about their age to feel like men and to, get into the war.
And still we don't know much about child soldiers, and women child soldiers were also there, and they really lost their femininity in that way, or their childhood or their innocence, because they were forced to dress as men and fight in the war, but they also did have other instincts as well. And then later on, I was talking to China Kitsky, and she's a child soldier from Sierra Leone. And as you were talking about post-war societies, post-traumatic stress disorder, and then women would have a cathartic effect in as much as painting, writing, singing, whatever it may be. And you were talking about a film which we couldn't show though, but...
Take the mic back from you. This seems to be the only functional mic, which is why we are quarreling over it. The very interesting thing that you said just now about the women's role, and clearly the stereotypical acceptable role for the woman was that of the nurse. So even that equally valorized and posterized, the glamour girl of the First World War would be the nurse, right? So this very interesting book written by one of the nurses who worked on the front line, Mary Borden. She was a Chicago heiress. She just decided to join the war effort, and she was refused. So she started, she joined the French Red Cross unit, and she wrote this book called, interestingly enough, The Forbidden Zone. And she writes very candidly, very, very sharply about what it means to be in such close proximity with males, suffering all manner of gaping wounds. And later on, and this is something that came to me from an essay again written by something that would interest you, Sreyashi, feminist academic called Carol Acton. She wrote this thing called Dangerous Daughters. What a wonderful title, Dangerous Daughters. And she quotes Mary Borden. I'll share that with you because it's directly related to the way in which, from different sides of the discourse, as it were, they are essentially talking about the same thing. And that thing is the futility of war. So I'll share a very tiny prose extract from Mary Borden, followed by, if everyone knows Wilfred Owen's poem Futility, then we'll just skip it, or maybe read 2 lines from it. But this, I think, deserves to be heard, because it is lesser known. It is all carefully arranged. Everything is arranged. It is arranged that men should be broken and that they should be mended. Just as you send your clothes to the laundry and mend them when they come back, so we send our men to the trenches and mend them when they come back. You send your socks and your shirts again and again to the laundry, and you sew up the tears and clip the raveled edges again and again, just as many times as they will stand it. And then you throw them away. And we send our men to the war again and again, just as long as they will stand it, just until they are dead, and then we throw them in the ground. So she comes back, she's witnessed it, and she writes it, and she couches it in domestic metaphor. You know, the thing that all male academics hate so deeply. But she makes it so potent, and she tells the same story of futility. Maybe we don't need to read futility, because I noticed many people nodding their heads. So maybe we can just move on, because that's something that is cuts through the war poetry across the ages.
Yeah, and Alexandra has been sitting quietly for the longest time, and we've been hogging the
But she has three very garrulous Bengali women sharing the stage with her.
But she has a really, really interesting take on, poetry technically not of the war, but completely appropriate for the war.
Thank you. When I was asked to join this session, I was terrified because I'm not an expert at all on the topic. And then I thought, who can I remember? And of course I remembered Wilfred Owen and all the English language poets. And then my next the next thing I thought about was, I come from what used to be Czechoslovakia, what is now the Czech Republic, and strangely enough, it's a country which changed name only during my lifetime about 5 times. And it was a country that came into existence as an independent democratic republic after the First World War, in which my grandfather fought. And we have a poet on the Czech scene who is someone who